Well, hello once again. It's good to see you back here for another Wednesday night, and I'm thankful to be back with you this evening. Last week we were at church camp, and we had a wonderful week. We saw 6 kids saved, and it just one person rededicating their life to the Lord. So it was just a fantastic week. And that is why we were not on Facebook and YouTube last week. So I apologize about that. But we're back this week, ready for lesson number 2 in Ezra and Nehemiah, reestablishing the Jewish homeland. If you remember from the first lesson, we looked at the introduction to both books as well as chapter number 1. So we're going to pick up right where we left off 2 weeks ago in this second lesson. And we're going to be beginning tonight in Ezra chapter number 2. So join with me here as we get started for our Bible study this evening. Ezra chapter number 2, we're going to be looking at several different things here in this chapter. We're not going to read through all of it, though. It's 70 verses long. It's a very long chapter. And the bulk of these verses in this chapter are giving us the names of the families that are going to be leaving Babylon and Persia. And they're going to be leaving that area, and they're going to be going back to Judah. And so this is a very long chapter dealing with a lot of different names. And while it's a little bit dry to read, and it's something that we're not going to be looking at every detail this evening, it is very important. It's important because it shows us how detailed the Jewish people were and how detailed the Jewish people are. We can see all the different names, the families, how large they were, how many people were traveling with them, where they came from, where they were going to. It's just so neat to see this much detail here in Ezra chapter number 2. Again, for time's sake, we're not going to go through all of it, but we'll hit a few of the highlights. So let's look at this. This chapter deals with the exiles' return. The exiles from 70 years prior are now going to be returning back to Jerusalem and Judea as a whole, and they're going to be going back to their hometowns and trying to rebuild them and reestablish them. But most importantly, one of the most important things that they're doing, and this is what the book of Ezra is all about, they're wanting to rebuild the temple. They're wanting to rebuild the altar. They're wanting to start the sacrifice all over again and draw their worship closer to God. And so that's an important lesson in this book, is drawing their worship close to God. And it's a lesson that you and I should learn today. So let's look at a couple of these points here as we open up Ezra chapter number 2. Follow along with me here, and let's look at a couple of these things. Okay, this chapter lists all the names of the families who were in captivity in Babylon and Persia, but they're now being allowed to go home. And so they're coming home for a purpose, for a reason. They're going to be coming home and reestablishing themselves there in Judah. And this is actually the very next point that we're going to be looking at here. They were released to go back to Jerusalem and Judah, not the northern half, which was Israel. Remember, several centuries earlier, the kingdom was split in half after Solomon. And you've got the southern kingdom that became Judah and encompassed Jerusalem. And it's the only half that halfway followed God, that had a few good kings here or there. I think if my mind's remembering correctly, there were a total of 8 good kings. And those 8 good kings all were from Judah. Israel didn't have any good kings. Israel was all bad, and there were no good kings in Israel. And so we see here that they're going to Jerusalem and Judea. They're heading back to their hometown, and there's some key names in this list that I want us to look at. And the list is very long, and again, we're not going to read all of them, but let's mention just a couple of them and share them with one another. First off, in verse number 2, verse 2 mentions Nehemiah and Mordecai. Now, what's interesting about this is that these two men are these two names are names that we are familiar with. Both of these names are very familiar, and they both would have had to go to Jerusalem if it's the two men that we are familiar with, the man of Nehemiah and the man of Mordecai we find in the story of Esther. If it is these two men we're familiar with, the interesting thing is that means they would have had to go to Jerusalem and Judea. They would have had to been there to kind of get everything started and established, and they would have had to go back to their respective homes homes in Babylon and Persia, and they would have had to go back to those places because, for one reason, we know for a fact, for one reason, both are recorded at later times doing things outside of Jerusalem. And so if it is the Nehemiah and the Mordecai that we know, they came, they helped kind of establish things, and then they left, all right? Now, while this is very, very possible, and as a matter of fact, I kind of lean towards this. I think it is the Nehemiah we know and the Mordecai we know. I think both of them came, kind of helped establish things, and then went back where they needed to be because God had called them to do something else. And while I think it's possible, we also need to understand that there is another possibility here, and it is that this is just two different guys, two different men that just so happen to have the same names as a Nehemiah and a Mordecai. Remember, I mean, there are a lot of people that have the same names, that carry the same names. Even today, a lot of people with the same first name and last name. If you just do a simple search of your name on Facebook or Google, you'll find dozens of other people with the exact same name that you have. So is it possible that this Nehemiah and Mordecai that are listed in verse number 2 is a different Nehemiah and Mordecai? Certainly. Nehemiah and Mordecai could have been very popular and common names back in those days. But it's also possible that it was the Nehemiah and the Mordecai that we know. And we're actually going to come back to this and make a couple of more points here in a few minutes about Nehemiah. But again, my opinion, just Pastor Nate's opinion, I believe it was the Nehemiah and the Mordecai that we knew. I think they went and they helped to get things started and then went back to fulfill the will of God. Okay. Let's look at a couple other points here. Verse number 16. Verse number 16 is very interesting. It mentions the family of Hezekiah. And so Hezekiah was a king. And so here we're seeing the king Hezekiah, his family is coming back to Judah and Jerusalem. Verse number 21 mentions the family of Bethlehem. Now, that's very interesting because we still have a city today in Judah called Bethlehem. It is a city that becomes very, very important in mankind's history. It's the city that the Bible tells us Jesus was born. And so verse number 21 is very, very important, mentioning the family of Bethlehem. Verse number 28 talks about the people of Bethel and Ai. Again, very important cities, very important places that go all the way back to Joshua, right? And so verse number 28 gives us some names that we would be familiar with. A couple others. Verse number 29 mentions the people of Nebo. Now, Nebo's important. Nebo goes all the way back to Moses. And it's the mountain that Moses was able to climb right on the other side of the Jordan. He was able to go up on Mount Nebo. He was able to look over, and he was able to see the promised land. Even though he was not allowed to go into the promised land, God allowed him to look over into it. God was allowed him to see what was going on. And so verse number 29 mentions the people of Nebo. Verse number 34 mentions the people of Jericho. This also is important. Jericho is widely known and understood and respected as the oldest inhabited city in the world, inhabited for a very, very long time, and it's still inhabited today. You can visit it if you go over to Israel. You can add it to your trip, and you can visit that city. And so very interesting that is mentioned. Verses 40 through 42 speak of the family of the Levites, and the Levites are mentioned in these verses, and some specific names and some specific people within the family of the Levites. Verses 43 through 58 speak of a group of people known as the Nethinims. All right, many believe the Nethinims to be later known as simply the Gibeonites. So there's a lot of them that are mentioned there, verses 43 through 58. In verse number 63, we find something very interesting in this chapter. The priests of Israel are warned. They're warned not to eat the holy things until the high priest has everything in order. See, as they're sitting there working, no doubt they're probably getting hungry, no doubt they're probably getting thirsty, and it would sure be convenient to just go ahead and start eating some of this holy bread that they're fixing, these things that are laying around that were given to God, that were given to the temple. But there was a problem. The high priest had not set things in order yet. They had not established the altar. They hadn't established the foundation. There were things that had to happen before they could eat of these holy things. And so this warning is given to us in verse number 63. Well, the person who gave this warning, and here's where it gets kind of interesting when we start digging into some of the detail and we start digging into what some of these things mean. The Tershatha was the one that warned them of this. Now, Tershatha, if I'm saying that properly, I think I am, Tershatha, this was not a person's name, rather this was a person's title, all right? And a Tershatha was a Persian governor. It was somebody that was in a place of prominence, a place that was in a great deal of respect. And so this was not a person's name, but rather a person's title. Now, why is this important? Well, we got to figure out who this person is. Who was it that was warning them not to eat the holy things? Who was it that was telling them the high priest needed to set things in order? Who was it that was wise enough to say, well, hold on, let's wait a little bit? So let's look at a couple of the possibilities. I believe probably the most likely, and this is my opinion, but I think the most likely outcome is that Tershatha was Nehemiah. And I think we got some biblical precedents to say that it was Nehemiah. Remember, clear back in verse number 2, we already talked that there was a man named Nehemiah who traveled with them. And of course, again, we talked about how there is the possibility that it was just some other guy named Nehemiah. Okay, but there is the possibility that it was the Nehemiah you and I know. And here's the other support to that. In Nehemiah chapter number 8, verse 9, and in Nehemiah chapter number 10, verse 1, which we will be getting to over the next 8 to 10 weeks, okay? But in those two verses, Nehemiah is referenced as the Tershatha, okay? If I'm saying that properly. He's referenced as that person. And so this would make the most sense. He's listed in verse number 2. In Nehemiah, he's actually called that he is that position. And so I believe that to be the most logical reason. I think if we go, let me go back a slide actually. If we go back and we look at this Tershatha, warning them to not eat of the holy things, I truly believe that it was Nehemiah, okay? But there is another possibility that I would say is possible, okay? And let's look at that for just a moment, okay? Let's say that the Nehemiah in verse number 2 was another guy. Let's just say that for a moment. Nehemiah wasn't there. Nehemiah was the Tershatha when Nehemiah came. But let's say Nehemiah, the prophet, wasn't there yet. It was another guy in verse number 2, okay? There is another real possibility. In chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, remember last week we talked about this guy named Sheshbazzar, all right? Sheshbazzar. And he was the prince of Judah. He was the one that was in charge. He was the one that was counting everything, making sure that the right amount of gold and the right amount of silver and all of these things were being transported. And so he was the prince of Judah. He was in a place of governorship, if you will, okay? And many believe that Sheshbazzar was Daniel, okay? And so it is possible that Nehemiah did not come, that the Nehemiah mentioned in verse number 2 was just some other dude named Nehemiah, and that the governor and that the prince of the area was actually Daniel. And so it is possible that the Tershatha was Daniel. And so, again, if we go back 2 slides, let's just look at this one more time, all right? In verse number 63, this Tershatha told them not to eat of the holy things. I believe the 2 most probable people that make sense was number one, in my opinion, number one is Nehemiah. And then number two, the other very good possibility is Daniel. I think it was one or the other. So that gives us a little bit of an interesting dig into that word and learning a little bit more about that this afternoon. So anyways, I think it could have been, I think it was one of those two. Again, personally, I think it was Nehemiah, the prophet. Letter E, all the exiles together. And we can see this all the way down in verse number 64 of the chapter. All the exiles together totaled 42,360 people. And so while that's not a huge population, that's in our world today here in America, it's just a small town, right? A small town that could support some restaurants and a Walmart, and so it's a small town. It's not a huge figure, but for them, this was very important. That was a big group of people leaving Babylon and Persia, and that were coming back to Judah to reestablish their homeland. And so, a very large number of people that are coming back to reestablish that. And just imagine if you've got an area of 42,000 people, that they're going to be having kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, and they're going to continue to repopulate. That 42,000 people could grow exponentially very, very fast. And so we see this is actually a really good number, a good-sized number of people coming back as exiles into their homeland. Let's look at some of the other numbers that are mentioned. Here's a couple other things. Servants and maids that came into the land as well totaled 7,337. Of that, there was a group of singers that would sing praises unto God, and that was a group of 200. We saw that they brought with them 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, 6,720 donkeys. Man, that was a lot of donkeys that they brought back with them. But they had to have help with all this work. They had to have help hauling the trees from the cedars from Lebanon. They had to have help moving those bricks and stones that had fallen down, that had been destroyed. They needed all this labor. And so we see horses, mules, camels, donkeys. Here's a couple other numbers that are mentioned. Drams of gold. I don't know off the top of my head. I could probably dig and find it a little bit more, but I didn't have time to do that today. But drams of gold was a total of 61,000. Now, again, I don't know what that totals in today's currency, but 61,000 of anything that is gold is going to be worth a whole lot of money. Also mentioned that they brought with them 5,000 pounds of silver. That is also a very lot of money. And also 100 priests' garments. So we see some really interesting numbers there at the end of chapter number 2. All right, let's go now to chapter number 3. Let's come over here to chapter 3 and let's get our outline ready here. So chapter number 3 is now dealing with the rebuilding of the altar, okay? Here's what's interesting. They said, you know what? We want to rebuild the temple, but the temple's going to take a long time to rebuild. We don't want to wait that much. We don't want to wait that much time. We want to get back to worshiping God now. Let's rebuild the altar first. We can start worshiping God, and then we can build the temple all the way around it. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to build this altar first. And the rebuilding began in the 7th month. The Bible records it began in their 7th month. That month to the Jewish people is called Tisri. And Tisri is that 7th month. On our calendar, for you and for me, it's somewhere in the end of September to the beginning of October. And it can vary a little bit. It can vary by a couple of weeks because the Jewish calendar is very, very different from our calendar. But it's somewhere in September and October is where that month, the Hebrew month, lies in our calendar, okay? As the people gathered there in Jerusalem, they all came to Jerusalem to see the altar being rebuilt. Jeshua, who was the high priest at the time, stood before them, and he began to rebuild the altar. He started putting stone upon stone. And here's what's really interesting. Look at letter C with me. Verse number 3 tells us that as they started rebuilding this altar, the words that's used here in the King James says they set the altar upon his bases. Now, the his is in reference to the altar. And so the altar is being set up on its own bases. What does that mean? Uh, Here's what it means. It's really, really awesome. It means they found the remains of the old altar. They found the old altar had kind of been broken down and beaten down, but they were able to kind of brush the extra off the top, kind of get a flat surface, have a foundation of the old altar, and they literally built the new altar directly on top. They were literally able to take the stones from the old altar for the foundation, put the new stones on top, and they rebuilt the altar on its exact same spot. And so that is a very important phrase there in verse number 3, setting the altar upon his basis. That shows us that they had a very good idea of where that altar was, what it was going to do. They knew where to take it, and they didn't second guess it. They knew exactly where to go and exactly where to rebuild. Letter D. Verse number 3 also tells us that fear was upon them. And now, when we talk about fearing God, we mean respect. We mean we're to respect God, we're to love God, we're to fear Him in all of His ways. But verse number 3 tells us that they were afraid, not a fear of respect, but a fear of they were afraid because the other people in the countries that were around them could come at any time and destroy them. And so this means that they were going to do all of this as quickly as possible. They wanted to get this altar built so they could restart the sacrifices. As soon as the altar was done, they wanted to get right on the foundation so they could get that foundation done. As soon as the foundation was done, they wanted to start rebuilding the temple itself. And then in the background of all of this, and again, we're not to this point yet in our study, but we'll get there in the next 3 or 4 weeks. In the background of all this, Nehemiah is saying, man, we got to go back. We got to get some more people. We need to bring more people back. We're going to have the altar rebuilt. We're going to have the temple rebuilt, and it's not going to be able to be defended. So we need to go get some more people. We need to bring them back, and we need to rebuild the walls around the city. And that's what Nehemiah is all about. So they're trying to do all of this as quickly as possible. Now, it tells us once they started their sacrifices, once they restarted everything there on the altar, the Bible tells us they burnt offerings all day long, in the mornings and in the evenings, from sunrise to sundown and everything in between. So all day long they were sacrificing unto the Lord. The Bible tells us, one of the next things it tells us is that they kept the Feast of the Tabernacles. That was the first feast they were able to keep. And the reason for that is because, remember, they came and they reestablished themselves in Tishri. Well, in Tishri, in that September or October for you and I, the first feast that comes up is the Feast of the Tabernacles. And so that was the first one that they held. Now, I've got this as a little side point there. If you look on your PowerPoint up here in letter F, this year, in 2020, the Feast of Tabernacles is October the 2nd through October the 9th. So you can see in our calendar, it lies right there the first week of October. So very, very interesting. Helps line everything up for us, all right? Letter G. In verse number 6, we learn that while they started the sacrifices, the foundation of the temple had not yet been laid. So they wanted to get the altar up first. Let's get the altar up first, and then we'll worry about the foundation of the temple afterwards. Verse number 7, they started collecting all the material. They went up, they started having all the cedar shipped in from Lebanon. They started bringing everything into Tyre. They started from Tyre down into Israel and started shipping them and dragging them. Remember, they had almost 7,000 donkeys. They had horses, they had camels, they had all this help to be able to bring it to Jerusalem where they needed it. So verse number 7 tells us all about how they started collecting all of those materials. But then in verses 8 through 13 start giving us a little bit more. In the second month of the second year, they began to build. What's that tell us? That tells us that if they started rebuilding in that first year, the first month of the first year, then it took them 13 months to collect all the material that they needed. So we got a period of 13 months collecting the material, and as they collect the material, finally after 13 months, they've got enough to get started. So in the second month of the second year, they began to build. And all Levites, if they were 20 years old or older, All Levites, if they were able and 20 years old and older, they were set forth to work on the temple. And they had to start going, they had to start building. And so they start putting things together. And the next thing you know, verse number 10 tells us that they stopped and they praised God. Why? Well, they were already praising God in their sacrifices. They were already worshiping God by sacrificing morning, noon, and night. They were already sacrificing to God all the day long. What else did they have to do? They stopped specifically and they praised God because the foundation was complete. They were done with the foundation. Now, not the whole temple. They still had a lot to build. They still had a lot to work on. But the foundation was set. The foundation was repaired. The foundation was now ready for them to finish the rest of the temple. And they stopped and they praised God. All the people shouted with praise. They were excited. They were thankful. They had really, really accomplished something there in verse number 11. But verse number 12. Verse number 12 tells us that those that were old enough to remember Solomon's temple, that means at this point in their life, they had to have been at least 70, 75 years old, if not 80, 85, maybe even 90. Some of these people that were between the ages of 75 and 90 years old that could remember Solomon's temple in all of its glory and how big it was and how many courts that it had and how many extra side things that it had and all the beautiful, just how beautiful and gorgeous Solomon's temple was. They were weeping because while the rest of the nation was excited and happy and rejoicing that the foundation was done and completed, they were sad because these foundations, while in one way they're happy that they're reestablishing the temple and the altar, and the other side, they remember seeing the grandeur of Solomon's temple. How big it was, how beautiful it was, everything that was there. And they were sad because the foundations of this temple were not going to be anything like Solomon's. It was going to be much smaller. It was not going to be nearly as big. And we can read more detail of that in Haggai. Haggai chapter 2 and verse number 3 says, if I remember right, says something to the effect of, you're crying, you're sad because this has nothing to offer. There's nothing, this one is nothing like the last. And so Haggai talks a little bit about that as well. So, all right, that brings us to the end of lesson number 2. We looked at chapters 2 and 3. I enjoyed those chapters and those details. I hope you did as well. Next week, we'll be looking at chapters 4 and 5. So I hope that you'll get everything ready and pre-read it. Kind of have an idea. That way next week you'll be able to follow along and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So next week, chapters 4 and 5. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for studying with me this evening. I pray that you and your family have a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll see you back Sunday morning for live worship services at 11 o'clock and Sunday afternoon at 2:30. God bless you. Have a wonderful day.